Welcome back to the We Who Thirst podcast, where Jesus is the living water and it is we who thirst. You can support this ministry by joining our Patreon. Our current series is Women in Context, a deep dive into the lives and stories of the women of the Bible in their cultural, familial, and historical context. Welcome back to the We Who Thirst podcast. With me today is Kristen from Sex Ed Reclaimed. I cannot wait to hear what she is going to tell us. Kristen has been a sexual health educator for 15 years. She is the owner and founder of Sex Ed Reclaimed, which provides Christian families with a full video library, which I love, of age-appropriate health education for children ages 13 to 18. So pretty much your kid's entire life at home with you. Her curriculum's available on her website, and she even has free samples available. I'll mention it now and as well as later. She also has a 15% off coupon for those who are listening. And you can use the coupon code Christian Parenting for that 15% off on her website. I'll also have that in the show notes comments, so you can see that as well. Good morning, Kristen. It is so great to have you here.
Good morning. Thank you, Jessica, for having me. I appreciate it. I'm glad
So
you reached
tell
out.
me, how did you get interested in sexual education? What kind of background do you have? I am just so curious in the origin story of everything that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, my origin story is basically rooted in like God's call on
Mm-hmm.
my life. I never was necessarily driven towards or passionate about sex ed as a young person. I didn't have much sex ed myself.
Yeah.
Rather, I got a lot of silence, and I think I did feel some shame around
Mm-hmm.
learning about sex, like many of us did, because it wasn't talked about very frequently. And so you knew it was like this um, forbidden subject, even though you had questions and curiosities and desires and leanings. None of those things were truly discussed
Yeah.
or seemed to be cared for. And so this was definitely not where I thought my life was heading. But I ended up essentially, I transferred to a Big Ten university from a Christian university. I felt a little bit bad about that because I was like leaving this seemingly like real Christian community to go to the secular place. But it was really in the secular place, so to speak, that
Mm.
I grew in my faith a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And in that place, I started studying public health, and I saw a lot of gospel correlation with community health and caring for people, meeting them where they're at, helping them to live healthier lives based on their choices and availability of resources and care, and connection to like service
Mm-hmm.
as the gospel ordains it and commands it, really.
Yeah.
And so I loved public health, but then I decided to stay at that university for my graduate degree. And during that time was when I was assigned to teach human sexuality.
Okay.
And I was really scared about that because,
Yeah.
like I said, I had never talked about the subject. But there was really no option. And human sexuality was a really popular class. I'm sure some of your listeners who had that offered in college, collegiate settings know like it's just a popular class because people do want to talk about it. They do want to learn. It is interesting and, sexy inherently. Like
Yeah.
kids want to learn about that. But I was amazed at how little college students knew,
Oh,
even though
wow.
I had just been a college student. And I felt like I was able to really weave in truth, speaking to people's conscience about
Yeah.
sex and how valuable it is and how
Mm.
important it is and how intimate it is and how, I mean, truly naked, both metaphorically and literally it is.
Yeah.
And I started to build a lot of confidence in talking about it, but that was only through prayer and dependence on the Lord and seeing that it was His and not mine, like, and not Satan's either. It wasn't this evil subject. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't an evil topic. It wasn't evil to teach. It was actually a really good, inherently beautiful topic, but the world has really taken it away from that beauty because Satan wants to use it for evil. And so I started becoming passionate about it then, but had no idea that it was going to be the course of my life. And I've
Okay.
been continuing like in this field because God has drawn me back to it again and again and again. And I think it's because there's a gap for Christians in
Yeah.
this space. They
Yeah.
don't know how to talk about sex with their kids and they don't know how to confront all the hard topics of our culture. But I do. I've done that many, many times. And so filming it and providing it for families, for kids, like I think you said 3 to 18. I mean,
Hmm.
that whole lifespan of childhood is really, really
Yeah.
important to me.
Yeah.
Um, it's a continual conversation. It's not just a talk any longer.
So for the ages 3 to 18, how many different programs do you have available? Because obviously the way you're going to explain sex ed to a 16-year-old is completely different than what you would do with a 3-year-old. So I'm assuming you
Yes.
have different programs, not just like one big one.
Yes. So I have a program for 3 to 6 year olds, which is called
Okay.
the Young Learner Curriculum. And it's taught at their level. It's very like, I kind of changed my voice to make it more childish and engaging for those kids. And their workbook is very different. It's more um, simple and color based. And it's really about parents watching it with their kids at that point because they're so
Yeah.
little. So
Hmm.
videos are shorter since their attention spans are shorter. And we go over simple things like body language, understanding somebody's body language. So if
Oh,
they're
yeah.
saying no with their body, then we're
I
not going
love
to give
that.
them a hug. Or how to verbally say no if you don't want somebody to kiss you, touch you. Um, what to call parts of your body, like appropriate names, the real
Hmm.
names, and how there's no
Hmm.
there's no embarrassment in that. These are the real names for your body, but
Yeah.
some of your little friends might not know these names, so we can just use them at home and use them with the doctor. And I talk it's mainly focused on safety for that
Okay.
age group because
Yeah.
that's an abuse
Absolutely.
age.
Yeah.
Like that age can be taken advantage of easily.
Hmm.
Abuse happens in that age. So them understanding what it is and calling it what it is without it being like this super depressing, like, oh
Yeah.
gosh, we're having this intense talk.
Yeah.
So it's really engaging, really fun. And then after that is 7 to 10 year olds, which are
Okay.
elementary learners.
Okay.
And it's broken up this way based on my experience because I've spent 15 years in classrooms. And
Yeah.
so to me, it made the most sense. That's more information that gets at more difficult topics, but it still keeps it pretty simple
Yeah.
and straightforward. And then after that, 11 to 13 year olds, my preteen curriculum has a ton of content in it. I mean, almost 100 videos of
Oh,
lessons,
wow. Okay.
full workbook, like really is getting at everything, but still noting that many of the kids in that age group might not have experienced or had conversations around this
Hmm.
topic, have experience, with the topic. And
Right.
so, but it's really a lot about puberty as well.
Yeah.
And then 14 to 18 year old is my last curriculum. And that's kind of the same. It's just expansive. I really expound upon all the topics and get at it with kids who are wondering things and are about to go off into the world and like need to have a worldview developed at that point
Yeah.
on some level, right? And be able to answer culture. Um, and I want kids to feel armed and ready to do that, not just with the right answers, but with like an ability to engage and think about these topics critically.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so I'm assuming, and that was, you said, 4 different programs. And I'm
Yes.
assuming each of them kind of stand alone. So if somebody is just
Yeah,
hearing about this and they have a
exactly.
15-year-old, they don't have to worry that they didn't do the 3 to 6-year-old program. They can just pick up
Totally.
whatever age their kids are at.
Yes, completely. And I do get asked that a good amount, and I need to probably make it even clearer on the website. But on my website, you can see the breakdown and the content in each curriculum, and you can
Okay.
actually hover over the content to see like what I talk about more. So not only does it
Awesome.
list out the content, but it like expands on that a little bit
Yeah.
with pop-up text bubbles. But yeah, you don't need to, if you're just starting at 8, you don't need to review the 3 to 6 because that is written for like toddlers. So
Right.
it's not really going to apply to your 8-year-old.
Love it. And I love that your website goes in more depth because different kids have different abilities,
Yeah.
different maturity levels. Maybe your 10-year-old actually needs the 11 to 13 rather than, or your 12-year-old is developmentally behind. They really need the
Right.
younger. So that really allows parents to see, okay, what is my child needing at this stage?
Completely. Yeah. I'm glad you bring that up because sometimes I have somebody, let's say they have a daughter who's 9 and a son who's 11, and their son is neurodivergent. And so they're like, well, I'm just going to actually have my kids watch it together, the 7 to 10 year old curriculum, because
Yep.
he's maybe not quite there. He hasn't really started going through puberty yet. Like, I think he'll be okay watching it with his sister. He gets along with his sister well enough,
Yeah.
et cetera. So it can totally be flexible for your
Yeah.
family and your unique circumstances.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Um, so one of the things we do on this podcast is talk about women of the Bible. So I always try to ask those I have as guests who your favorite woman of the Bible is.
I love that question. I think that's great. There's so many women mentioned in the Bible, and they're so like powerful and strong in their own rights. And I think I was thinking about this question like different seasons of my life, I probably would
Mhm.
choose different women because they
Absolutely.
speak to that season.
Yeah.
Um, but as of now, I and there's not a ton about her in the Bible, but Priscilla, which will sound familiar to most
Yes.
people, she was just such a powerful church leader, and I love that she like led the church,
Hmm.
but also really worked alongside not only her husband but like the congregation. And I
Hmm.
found in Acts 18:26, it says, it's talking about somebody else, and it says he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla heard him, she and her husband invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. So it's almost like they
Mm.
heard the speaker and they were like, okay, that's great, but we feel like we can disciple him a little bit more, speak into his life a little bit more, help maybe refine or continue his sanctification process. And they like invited him over and just hung with him. And I can only imagine the conversations that they had. But I just think that that's such a cool, it's almost you barely like notice the verse, but it's almost like they were just like, we're gonna take him under our wing too, and like pour into
Yes.
him theologically, spiritually,
Yes.
whatever.
Yes.
Um, and I appreciate that. So she's maybe a minor, very minor character, but I like that she felt called to lead and was going to
Hmm.
do so by ministering to. I mean, I think it says like in Acts 2, like the poor and the
Hmm.
young and other leaders, and really figure out how Jesus fit into the greater story and how they could disciple others. So I like that.
Yeah, she's absolutely fantastic. I love that. And just listening to you talk, thinking about our topic at hand, sex education, your favorite woman of the Bible, and the early church with the female leaders. Titus 2 talks about older women teaching younger women. Thinking about how potentially in these cultures, it's the older women's job to give younger women sex education. So that could be part of what these women are doing is helping the congregation, but especially the younger women, because they probably would have split up those any sex conversations by gender. Um, how the older women would be hands-on helping prepare younger women for their marriages and their lives and all of that sort of thing. And so that's just a really neat thing to think about how that could be part of the ancient culture. And since, especially since you're dealing with house churches, you're not dealing with our idea of church where everybody's kind of far away from each other, not related. You're dealing with small groups of people where there's this deep family relationship where on multiple levels it would be appropriate for the older women to be giving sex education to the younger woman in that both household and church spiritual setting.
Yeah, I love that. That's a really good point. It makes me think of the tents in like the Old Testament
Hmm.
where they would go during their time of uncleanliness, right? And I just wonder what kind of fellowship happens there for women. Like,
Yes.
and even around sexual health education and puberty in their bodies, like, did they talk about periods and what they knew about periods and, how pregnancy happened or what pregnancy and childbirth were like? Like, did they
Yeah.
have a really deep connection during that time? And obviously, we don't need tents anymore. We don't do that anymore. But like, it could have been a really beautiful time of women connecting with other women and, like you're saying, older women really guiding and leading
Yeah.
too. I don't know, but that's
Yeah.
kind of my assumption.
Yeah. And I find even today, and I'll be curious to see if this is your experience as well, just in the realm of sexuality, I find that women talk about it a lot more than men do. We hear about men and like locker room talk and those sorts of things. I was telling my husband the other day, I was like, men in unhealthy relationships or who have an unhealthy view of sexuality talk about it a lot in bad ways. Men with healthy views of sexuality generally don't talk about it at all.
Mm,
Women in healthier relationships often feel safe enough to talk about it. It's the ones who are in unhealthy relationships who don't. He was
so
like,
interesting.
yeah, I think that's right. Because I know more about my friends' sex lives than my husband knows about his. Like, I know things about some of his friends' sex lives because I'm friends with their wives that he's
Right.
clueless on. Not that we're
Yeah.
just like sharing random details, but
No.
women, birth control, this, that, the other thing,
Mm.
how our bodies work. We're sharing those sorts of details. Do you find similar experiences as well?
Oh, completely. I mean, that's such a good point. And again, like you're saying, I don't think it's just to air dirty laundry and
Hmm.
like talk about super intimate stuff that
Yeah.
your husband wouldn't want other people to know. It's
Right.
more like we just share about our lives more fully and we
Hmm.
fellowship differently.
Hmm.
And, my husband and I went on the mission field abroad for years. And one of the things we noticed was that within the missionary community there, we never talked about this topic
Mm.
ever at
Oh,
all.
wow. Yeah.
And the reason that that mattered is because we ended up leaving the field due to some sexual brokenness on the field and lack of really caring about that, even
Hmm.
from higher up agency levels
Hmm.
um, who were supporting us. And so when we came back, my husband was really intentional about in our community group, or like some people call it life group or whatever, Bible
Yeah.
study. He would hang out with the men that we would have male and like men and guy or girl nights and we'd split
Yeah.
up and he would like talk about sexual brokenness and
Mm.
accountability and like who is participating in this and why and how can we help you to get away from that. And he's just a lot better at talking about sex and sexuality because he saw so much pain and realized it's
Hmm.
because men typically don't share that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
um, and that hurts the body. And
Yeah.
actually, I think that's what Satan wants. I think Satan wants men to be real quiet on it, unless it's a big joke or, like you said, a locker room talk situation, which is sexual immaturity. But
Yes.
it's not totally their fault. It's because they've never really been discipled in that and led in
Right.
that and shown how can I talk about this and still be honoring to God, but also be honest and
Yeah.
authentic. And maybe that's not with like 20 guys, right? But with a few
Fair.
friends.
Yeah.
So, and that can only help your marriages and help your
Absolutely.
families.
Absolutely.
So, really
And I
good.
feel like some of what you're describing is some of the toxicity you're seeing and how from purity culture and how that affects men. Almost
Yes.
this shut down of all desire. You can't even notice a beautiful woman. Like noticing is equated with lust in purity culture. And so men are just in some ways taught in religious circles to be shut down about it. Um,
You're spot on. I was just talking with somebody yesterday who wrote a really great book, and I have this on my resource page on my website. I
okay.
can send you a link as well, but it's written towards men, and it's called "The Sex Talk We Never Got," written by
Yes.
a male counselor. Yes, and he was saying that men have been sexualized, which when I think of that word, like probably most people when they hear that word, I think of women
Oh, yeah.
and how women are obviously sexualized, right? Like noticing beauty is, like you said, conflated with like, oh, that's lust. And
Yeah.
it's very confused with um yeah, just wanting them or essentially lusting after them, just like you said. But masculine sexualization is more about making men seem like this is all they want, this is all they need,
Hmm.
this is the only way to talk about it is to talk about it in a degrading way, and there's
Hmm.
nothing more to it. Sex is kind of a game. What bases can you get to? Did you
Yep.
score?
Yep.
um that kind of language, and that's a sexualization of masculinity. And I thought that was a really interesting point because
Hmm.
men have been sexualized and essentially conditioned, socially
Yep.
conditioned to act and be that way when that is certainly not what we're called to at all. And
Right.
so there's much more to sex, and we know that there's much more to sex. And I'm big on that in my curriculum by starting young with boys and girls on like
Yeah.
naming emotions, being clear about
Yes.
what your emotions are. And as they get a little bit older, I clearly say, like, if you know what you're dealing with, if you know your emotion and why you're having it, you're going to be less driven towards addictive behaviors like porn, because
Yes.
you're not going to be going to porn for your assertion of independence or power or to deal with your anxiety or depression or your sadness, or as a reward. You're going to respond to your emotions in a healthy way because you have a higher emotional intelligence. And that's
Yeah.
something that wasn't super encouraged with men or women when they were young, but particularly with little boys.
Yeah.
It was a missed, yeah, it was gap. So
Yeah. I feel like a lot of Christian men, just bouncing off of what you say, their sex ed was from the secular culture. And so when they're trying to live godly lives, it's mixed with the secular culture, sexualization of men that you just described. And especially godly men, they have that push pull, like sex is important to me, but and they're trying to untangle threads. They're not always sure how to do that, so they are quiet about it, which can then, unfortunately, I would imagine, lead to perpetuating the cycle because they then don't know how to talk about it with their own children and how
Precisely.
to bring it to their children and to model um, healthy male views around sex for their families.
Yeah, I completely agree. Totally spot on. And that's one of the biggest hindrances towards discipling your kids sexually, essentially, is because there's no model for it. You don't know how to do that. At most, maybe you got a book or you got to talk. Or, I mean, honestly, when I ask people at conferences and parents at conferences or in group settings, where I'm teaching or something, and I say, who in here feels like they had great sex ed and they really learned well? It's typically people who grew up in secular families. There was no
Mm,
faith background. And so their mom or dad or both were really honest about sex with them. Like they didn't care. There was no shame there. They were maybe overly honest about their own behaviors, but that or like they grew up with a doctor in the family or a
ah,
nurse who was
mm-hmm.
very clear. So at least they got good anatomy lessons and
Yeah.
they learned all the appropriate names and there wasn't shame around the body. But it's like that, those are like the only two options. I never hear people
Mm,
say, oh my gosh, I had such great sex ed from my family, my parents, they were so great. They're wonderful about it. And I grew up in a Christian family. Like that is
yeah.
a rarity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a work of spiritual warfare and Satan. But I
Mm,
also think it's because it perpetuates that cycle like you're talking about. They just don't know how to do it in the next generation, so they don't.
yeah.
They choose to be disengaged with that, not to ask their kids, not to talk about it. If they
Mm-hmm.
do, it's really awkward.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I'm trying to think generations here. I know purity culture for our generation was a big thing. It like kind of rose during my late high school, early college was like the heyday of purity culture. And I feel like some of that was my parents' generation push back on like the sexual revolution. They want to bring it in bounds, but they ended up creating like a pendulum to the other side of toxicity on the other side. And I feel like now we're trying to be like, how do we train our kids, teach them about sex in age appropriate ways alongside, and I love this with your curriculum. I'm so excited. I love that you are weaving together sex education, the information they need, with some emotional intelligence components, with things that help prevent them from being abused. Like I love that you're weaving all of those things together because those are what our generation needed.
I mean, it is. It's a response to that. I'm glad you picked up on that and saw that because it's a very full, holistic conversation around
Mhm.
sex. And that's, I think, what the Lord wants. That's how He designed it. He designed it as all parts that go together.
Yeah.
All of it is meant to glorify and reflect His goodness.
Mm,
And sex doesn't, is sex, the sex talk. Well, first of all, I don't believe in the talk, right? It should be a
right.
lot of conversation, like I said
Yep.
earlier. But the sex talk is not about the mechanics of actually having sex. It is so much bigger than that.
Yes.
And just to reduce it to like quote unquote the plumbing is
Right.
silly. It's so unnecessary because it's actually a much more beautiful, full conversation about the
Mm-hmm.
integration of like self
Mm-hmm.
and how we operate in the world and how we view the opposite sex and dating and
Mm.
healthy marriage and
Mm-hmm.
how we call out abuse and stand up for social justice and that. And it really is a full conversation around the topic. And that's why there's so much. I don't want parents to feel overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, she has 100 lessons in here. That's so much.
Right.
It's just because there's a lot that you can discuss and talk
Yeah,
about and really fully put into conversations. And I want that to be available to parents who just need some language for it.
absolutely. I'm going to bounce off of what you just said with the 100 lessons and parents feeling overwhelmed, because I know lots of busy parents, that's can happen very easily. Running kids back to sports practices, when I'm going to have time to view 100 lessons? Are those, and the 100 lessons was the 11 to 13 program, kind of
Usually
middle
11 and
school,
up. Yeah,
okay.
11 and up. Yeah.
11 and up. Okay. So you have 100 lessons there. Are they like sequential? Like you need to watch them one, two, three, four, or are they like, okay, this is the topic we really need to hit today because X happened at school, so we're going to hit lesson 23. How does that work within the program?
Yeah, you're right on again. You can do either. Like I
Okay.
have a calendar with each curriculum that tells you how the curriculum can be viewed according to how I planned it. But you don't have to do that. So let's say your 10-year-old goes to school today and or I don't know, goes to a church group or whatever,
Yeah.
sports camp, and somebody there is like, I'm no longer using those pronouns, and they're 10. And you're like,
Hmm.
man, we already have to have this conversation. Like, I don't know what to do about that. I don't know how to
Yeah.
respond to that. You can go watch the pronoun video. Like,
Awesome.
you don't have to wait till it's scheduled. You can go watch it, you can review it, and you get lifetime access to curriculum. So you can watch
Awesome.
it as much as you want. It never goes away. I never charge you again. Um, you can use it for your younger kids, as they grow up into that age, but it is very flexible for the family to watch what applies, because things do happen, events do
Yeah.
occur.
Yeah.
They might hear about something, maybe the news and all of this, conversation
Yeah.
about politics, and we're talking about abortion in the news. And it's like, well, let's actually watch her video on that,
Yeah.
and see what she says and engage on this topic and think about how we can respond to this topic. So you don't have to go in order, but I do lay out an order there if you want to kind of have a proper schedule, especially for like
Yeah.
homeschooling parents or something, so
Right.
that they can schedule it.
And I love that it's a both and, like you can do either or, both and. You mentioned for the youngest program that it's something you expect kind of parents to watch with the kids. The older programs, obviously parents watching with the kids is always going to be a benefit. It can provide conversations, but is it necessary?
Good question. No, it's not. Like, by the time that they can push play and pause on their own, it's not. They don't have to watch it. I think it's unique to the family. I think some kids probably already by 7, 8, 9 don't feel as comfortable watching it with their parent, and so maybe their parent checks in after, or they review their workbook, or they say, "Hey, I've already watched those videos, and I know one of the questions she asked was this. Like, what did you say to that?" So maybe they engage on in that capacity.
Okay.
But other parents are like, yeah, I can totally watch my 9-year-old like she would want me to.
Yeah.
So it really depends, but pretty much after they're able to, and you trust them to actually engage with it, they can watch it on their own. It's up to the parents.
I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this question. I'm going to give you the background, then I'll figure out how to formulate the question.
That's okay.
I try at the beginning of the school year to just have kind of a week where I spend some extra focus. Like we try to weave sex ed conversations into life all the time anyway. But right before school starts, my kids go to public school. I try to have a little bit extra education just to make sure that they are remembering details, because who knows what they're going to hear at school. And I want to make sure we've talked about it first. But as we were doing that this year, I noticed one of my kids, I was reading a book about it, and the child got up and just started like they're still listening, but they were uncomfortable and wandering the room, and just showing various signs. And even was like, that kind of makes me uncomfortable. And I'm like, okay, well, you need the basic information, but thank you for telling me how you feel. What sort of signs and signals would you have parents looking out for the comfort levels of their kids? And how would you recommend parents respond to that, since this can be a very shame-filled kind of, for all parties, tricky topic to talk about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love your response to your child, that you said, like, you do need this information, but I recognize your discomfort. I think acknowledging, like normalizing that, acknowledging the discomfort and saying, yeah, that's how I felt, or that's how many kids feel, or this topic can be uncomfortable. Could you tell me a little bit more about why you feel uncomfortable? Or did anything happen at school that made you
Mhm.
uncomfortable? Um, and kind of ask them a few questions to see if they will respond to that or
Mhm.
open up about that. But I think it's okay to pause, even for a few weeks or a few days, to pray about it, to ask the Holy Spirit for discernment on where to go
Mhm.
next. Um, Maybe if they are doing, like in my curriculum with the workbook and writing their answers out, kind of reviewing those answers with them, reviewing what they have learned and affirming this is really good information. Like,
Yeah.
you are made well, your body is a good thing.
Yeah.
And this is so important for you to learn about. But I understand if it makes you uncomfortable, like we can pause for a little bit. I would
Mhm.
just try to get at the particulars. What exactly was it? Because
Yeah.
sometimes there could have been an event, or they could be reminded of something, or maybe they saw a scary TV show or something that, pictured what I was talking about in the video, and they aren't sure how to articulate that to you. So I would
Yeah.
really engage with the child, but pause. There's no need
Yeah.
to watch in discomfort. But if they do seem like they're almost like moving inward with their body, like they're kind of
Mhm.
covering their eyes, or which there's nothing weird that they're going to see on my
Yeah.
videos, but like, they're crossing their arms, they seem unengaged, maybe they're providing some resistance. Like, I don't really want to watch those. First of all, I think that's normal developmentally for kids to do, but also to question a little bit, well, can you tell me why? Because I know when I was a kid, like I really needed to learn this, but nobody talked to me about it. And I just want to be a space for you to talk about this.
Hmm.
We can take a break for a couple months or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But making sure that there wasn't like an event
Yeah.
or,
That's really wise. Yeah. Yeah. Because I know different kids, some kids are curious, some kids are
Mhm.
not. When I first became a mom, I remember like, follow your kids' curiosity, only answer as much as they're asking and those sorts of things. But one of my kids never asks, doesn't want to know, doesn't. And so I kind of have to be like, all right, love, I'm gonna have to give you some details here. You're not curious, you're not asking, but I have to. You're gonna go to school and you're in fourth grade and somebody's gonna say something and you need to hear it from me first. So how do
I
you
love that
recommend
honoring.
navigating kids who aren't curious? I feel like the curious ones are a little bit easier, but how do you recommend navigating kids who aren't curious, maybe not asking, or as you mentioned, a neurodivergent child who's a little bit developmentally behind, but maybe they're in sports or public school settings where other kids who aren't developmentally behind are going to be talking about these sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if they're not curious, that could very well mean they don't have questions about the topic and aren't concerned. So you might want to start at things that they need to be concerned about. For example, like a 14-year-old neurodivergent boy is still going through puberty
Yep.
and his body is still starting to smell and he's still growing hair and maybe he needs to consider shaving or showering more. He might still be having, like erections in the night that he doesn't know what those are. And so acknowledging that kind of elephant in the room of like, hey, your body is going through this. And so I know you might not have questions, you might not be curious, which frankly is probably not true. He probably does have some questions in there at some point, right?
Yeah.
But you might not be asking questions, but I really want you to learn about and anatomically what your body is going through and why it's going through what it is. And so you could start with more factual stuff there.
Yeah.
You don't have to get into all the big ideas of
Mm-hmm.
sexuality and
Mm-hmm.
kind of the hard hitting topics. You could just start with the basic facts of like, I want you to make sure that you're being healthy
Yes.
and that you're being safe. And so we're going to
Yes.
watch as it relates to my curriculum, or you could say we're going to talk about, these three topics. We're going to, and then that's it. And we'll
Yep.
stop there and you can let me know later. And a question might come up 6 weeks later for him or her
Mm-hmm.
about the topic. And then, you can do a little bit more. But if if they genuinely don't seem curious or interested, then I would at least start with the facts and take kind of a health approach
That's
to
good.
like, I just want you to be healthy and safe as you go through this because you and a lot of your friends are going to be going through puberty and that can be hard, but
Yeah.
everybody goes through it. It's normal. It's necessary. And I want you to know why and
Yeah.
how to deal practically with some of that.
Yeah. I love that. No, that's really helpful. One thing I have heard just in my perusings of this topic is that it's very helpful for the kids to have the parents not position themselves as experts necessarily, but to let the kids know that they know about the topic. I saw something online about a mom who her little boy saw porn
Mm,
and he didn't even think to tell her because it never come up in conversation. And
yep.
he didn't know mommy even knew what porn was. So why would he tell her? Because he didn't knew she knew these things existed. How can
Yeah.
parents, obviously your sex ed curriculum is a great way, but what's other ways that they can kind of position themselves as experts? Like you can ask mommy and daddy anything, ask us before Google. Like, how can parents do that to help their children and open up those lanes of conversation?
Yes, I love this question because it's very practical and I'm all about practicality and how you actually play out this narrative in the real world. So one way I think that parents can make sure that they are the safe space and that their kids don't go to Google and like ask their friends stuff because they don't think their parents know or can answer is to utilize daily opportunities or weekly opportunities. So maybe like for example, the other day I was at kind of a fair, like a town fair, if you want to call it that. And there were gay couples walking around. And my daughter already knows what that is and knows that families are different and people have different values and all of this. But she asked me something about one of the couples, and I answered. And
Yeah.
it sounds so simple, but so many of us grew up in an environment where we had a question and we were shut down, or we were told it wasn't appropriate, or not to worry about it, or it didn't matter, or like, oh, that's too big for you, that's too heavy for you. So
Yes.
just,
Yes.
and to this day, I mean, I saw, it's kind of a gripe for me, but I saw a big Christian radio station, like one of the most popular Christian radio stations. They posted about sex, which I thought was kind of weird and random, but they posted that if your kid asks you what is sex, you can tell them it's too heavy for them to carry. It's like a heavy piece of baggage. And so many people were like, oh my gosh, yes. But then actually there was a lot of commenters, because I went down that rabbit hole of
Yeah.
like, no, like that's not an appropriate answer. Like your kid is asking you what it is. Like you need to
Yeah.
have some sort of answer for them. And anyway, and it was funny because the radio station was using a real life example from Corrie ten Boom, who lived in
Yes.
like a long time ago. So I was
Yeah.
just like, hey, maybe that was appropriate then. It no longer is. We have
Right.
devices and sex is everywhere.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Some
one
advice
big
does
thing
not age.
yeah. Yeah. It seems nice though, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
this is too heavy for you. You can't carry it. It's like, yeah, that's nice for the parent because they don't have to engage in anything uncomfortable and they can just move on, but it does nothing for the kid. Nothing.
Who's
And so
honestly
you
curious.
yeah, you want to show your kid you are the safe space by answering questions, by being present, by even utilizing these daily opportunities of like, hey, mom, I noticed. I mean, your kid is not going to say it this maturely, but essentially, I noticed on the news that they're talking about abortion. Like, why do we believe what we believe again?
Yeah.
And you bring that up, or you say, hey, what do you know about this? Or what do your friends think about this topic? Or what are your friends saying about this topic? Or maybe you're watching a TV program together and a couple is not treating each other well, and there's red flags about a guy or
Mm-hmm.
girl who's dating. You can say, do you know what red flags are in a relationship? Like, would you put up with the way that he's
Yes.
treating her? What would you
Yes.
do if a boyfriend did that? How would you respond? Really asking them, and even if they're like, I don't know, I'm not sure, like it's not going to happen to me, it gets them thinking
Mm-hmm.
and realizing that you are a safe space, and that what if this did happen, how would I respond? Because
Mm-hmm.
things happen to Christians too.
Yeah.
They
They.
happen
Oh,
to us
yes.
all the time. We enter into bad relationships, we get manipulated, we might sext and then experience ramifications from that. We get into
Mm-hmm.
porn, we
Mm-hmm.
deal with abuse, we're victims. Like all of these things can happen to us. Christians get abortions. So we need to talk to our Christian children who are going to grow up to be Christian adults, ideally, still love the Lord, about these situations. Why do they happen? What are the outcomes? How
Yeah.
can we respond in a loving manner to those who experience them? And that's really just utilizing daily opportunities to ask them what they think
Yeah.
and why they think about that. And that shows that you do care, and they're more likely to come to you when they see porn at a sleepover or something, because you've already provided that space for them.
Yes. I love that. That's so practical and hands-on. Our time is almost up. I've been loving this conversation. Is there any final thoughts or education you want to share with our audience about sex education and what you do?
Sure. I think my final thought for parents who are listening is that you can do this. It is
Mm.
doable. You
Hmm.
don't need to make it into some big talk, this sit down thing where you pass your kid a book and you ask them if they have any questions and you move on. Like, this is not your parents or the baby boomers generation any longer.
Yeah.
Many of us did go through purity culture. We did experience legalism, or we experienced what the world thought of sex and sexuality, and it wasn't super helpful.
Hmm.
And we learned from Google. And first, I think you need to reckon with that. You need to think about your own sex ed, whether you're a dad or a mom, and consider how that impacted you. Pray about
Mm.
that, journal about that.
Mm.
Maybe there's something you haven't dealt with from your past. Maybe you even
Hmm.
need to seek out a little bit of counseling
Yeah.
to really consider. Go through that kind of thing first, if you
Yeah.
can. Your own viewpoints on it all. I mean, I have couples reach out, and I should say I have women reach out more commonly, who say, my husband does not want to talk about this, so I'm going to end up doing it all. So like, can what would you recommend? And it's like, man, that kind of breaks my heart a little bit, because there's
Yeah.
probably a reason he won't. And he
Yeah.
needs to, like, for his own life and his own joy and his own relationship with
Hmm.
the Lord and his wife, like he needs to
Hmm.
dig into that, even though it can suck.
Hmm.
So I would encourage parents to dig into their own worldviews and experience of sex ed first, or in lack thereof, and then know that you're still qualified. You can still do this. It is doable. The reason I provide conversations for kids to watch and listen to is because I want to give parents the language by
Yes.
actually just doing it like for them. But
Mm-hmm.
that's not where it ends. You
Yeah.
are then meant to engage and have organic conversation from there. And you will. I guarantee that you will when this is a topic that's explored in your house. So it's doable, but it's really good first to be looking inward and thinking about how am I impacted by my youth, what my parents did or didn't teach me, or school did or didn't teach me, church, etc. And what do I want to pass on to my kids? What
Yeah.
don't I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is such great advice. And I love how you really brought out the introspection us as parents need to do. I know, especially for us adults, parents who have sexual abuse, sexual assault in our background, that can make it extra difficult to engage these topics with our kids because PTSD, all of anxiety, body reactions to even talking about sexual things to a sexual abuse survivor can be exceptionally triggering. And so I appreciate that you have curriculum like this that can also provide a buffer for those parents.
Yeah.
They need to do their own internal work, counseling, all of the things, but their kids aren't necessarily going to stop growing up until the parents have done all the internal work. And so your curriculum provides that buffer where they can still have conversations, make sure their kids are um, getting the information they need in a safe way, but they don't have to drive every conversation fully. They can kind of bounce off of what you teach. And I love that you provide that resource for people who just don't know themselves, people who aren't sure how to handle tricky situations, victims of abuse where it can be literally triggering, all of those things. I love what you're doing. I am so thankful for it. Thank you for joining me today, and I cannot wait for our listeners to get your curriculum in their hands. Again, she has a 15% off coupon. The code is Christian Parenting. You can get that on her website, which I will link her website, her Instagram, the coupon code. All of the goodies will be in the description of this episode. Thank you so much, Christian. It has been a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you. I so appreciate you reaching out, and I'm glad we could connect. This was
Absolutely.
really fun and encouraging.
Awesome. Well, may the Lord bless you all and keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. Have a great day. Until next time, we will see you then. Thank you for listening to the We Who Thirst podcast. A complete bibliography of the research behind this episode is available at wewhothirst.com. If you would like the full show notes, an opportunity to discuss each episode in a safe Discord chat, or simply to support this ministry, visit our Patreon. I am so thankful and have honored to have had you here with me for this episode. Until next time, remember, Jesus is the living water, and it is we who thirst.